Section 3, we're looking at political, social, religious, and economic changes that influence the way Americans think and act. That's a loaded sentence. Political changes, as in they told the king to go away. Social changes, in regards to the new and unique culture that is developing here in the American colonies, separate and independent from Great Britain. Religious. That one's loaded, obviously. There was a senior level college course offered at my university on early American religion, and that was the professor's specialty. That's what he spent his career studying, was early American religion. And that's what you can choose to study at an in-depth level. All just unpacking that one word, of how that influenced the way people think at that time. And so absolutely someone's geography can affect what they do. In particular, in this first part, we'll think of occupation. Okay, so the different ways that people made a living. So first off, you have to adapt to the geography. What we need to realize about Henderson County is that the biggest employers in this county are the schools and the hospitals.
GE.
There are manufacturing, private sector jobs to be had, but what you must realize are those are the minority. You are likely to be a public sector employee if you choose to stay in Henderson County. That's just the stats. Ergo, the money's not here. The money is in the big cities. And why? Well, that's just, you have to adapt to the geography. If you want to stay here, you need to find your niche within this county. Just like the colonists had to adapt to their geography. For example, in New England, if you find yourself in upstate New York, enjoy the warm weather while it's there. Because guess what? In a month it's going to start getting cold. And it will remain cold until late April, early May. And they'll have about 2 weeks of spring, a month of summer, and then back to being cold. And that's just life in upstate New York. Same in Maine, same in Connecticut, Rhode Island, etc. And so their growing season is very short. The amount of rainfall they have relative to us is very small. They still get their rain, but it's nothing like here where it's raining every day at 4 o'clock. That's just life in New England. And so you're not going to see the ginormous farms like you do along the coast of Carolina. You'll see small farms. Ergo, the money in New York is not in farming. What is it in? It's in business. If you go to New York, you don't go to New York to be a farmer. You go to New York to be a business person, to make the money. Now, what types of businesses were there in New England? Well, the most profitable export was ships. Shipbuilding. Boston Harbor. Go take a tour of Boston sometime. It's one of the prettiest and most fun cities I've been to yet. And eat lobster while you're there. Go see the history stuff. It's incredible. But shipbuilding was actually the early profitable industry of New England. But also whaling. If you really want to tackle a challenging book, and I have, read Moby Dick. There is a whole quarter of the book on nothing but types of whales. And if you muscle through that, you're through the hard stuff. And then you get to the story of Queequeg and Ishmael, and aboard this whaling vessel chasing the great white Moby Dick. And, spoiler alert, the whale wins. And so the book is all about the fishing and whaling industry in New England and how they would catch these whales and turn their fat into oil, eat the meat, use all the parts of the whale for various stuff. And so that's a little about the economy of New England. These people were hardy. What was the culture like in terms of religion? I'm sure you've heard of the phrase the Puritan work ethic. Maybe you've even heard it called the Protestant work ethic. It's an emphasis on hard work. The Apostle Paul, I believe it was in the Corinthians, said, if you do not work, you will not eat. He was establishing a system of government for the early churches. Was it a different book?
2 Thessalonians.
Thank you. Yeah. So in 2 Thessalonians, if you do not work, you will not eat.
Also, that epistle was not written by Paul.
It wasn't Paul.
No, it was written by a later author in his name.
Thank you. So, yes, in establishing these early church governments, you have this Puritan or Protestant, or call it what you will, work ethic that you are expected to contribute to the community, and there are consequences if you do not. And so this emphasis on hard work, on modest living, the idea of not giving in to excess, living according to certain standards, in personal virtue like honesty, thriftiness, and obedience. While New England was founded, while Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded, so that the people of the colony could practice their own religion and choose and live their own way of life. These Puritans were very strict in their behavioral expectations. The middle colonies, a little different. We're thinking of Virginia, thinking of even technically New York or Philadelphia could be lumped into this, depending on where you're talking about in those places. But along the coast, there were a lot of busy ports. Philadelphia was the second largest city in the British Empire. And New York, there's already been violent conflict over control of New York, where the British won the rights to it. And so, yes, busy ports characterize some of the middle colonies. Industry, to some degree, once more, we're not talking about the Southeast with its long growing season yet. We'll get into the southern colonies. We're still talking about industry is where a lot of the money is tied up in the middle colonies. And this is also where a lot of the immigrants from European countries are coming into. By the end of the 1800s, if memory serves, there had been 30 million European arrivals that had been processed through Ellis Island alone. Now, there had been many millions processed through the immigration station at Angel Island and San Francisco on the West Coast, but 30 million from Europe, just Ellis Island, by 1880, if memory serves. Now, that's a lot of immigrants coming from a particular place, attracted to a particular place for certain reasons. Mainly because they're not going to the southern colonies, because they're going to struggle to find work. Now, as I told you, my dad's family can be traced back to pre-revolution North Carolina. And I can only imagine they wound up here because they were poor. Because the big money was along the coast. If you were going to live in a southern colony and you had the resources to start a business or purchase an existing one, you were getting into large-scale agriculture. Why? Because in North and South Carolina, even in August, it's hot as blazes out there. And we've adapted to that, right? I'm ready for the fall. I'm ready for it to cool off a little bit. But part of the attraction and lure of the South is their warm and long, warm season. And that's also great if you are a farmer. Because if you've been awake in the past 3 months, you've noticed we've had a ton of rain. And that's not uncommon. I mean, this is an unusually wet year, but it's not uncommon to have wet years here. And that's great for agriculture because all of that silt washes off of the mountains, carrying with it rich nutrients, and that silt winds up along the riverbanks of the French Broad and the Davidson and the Broad River, etc., where, if you've noticed, there are large farms. So, back to the coast. There are some decently sized farms here in Henderson County, particularly our apples. But where the big money is in farming is along the coast, where there are tidewater crops. Tidewater crops are crops that grow well in the low, flat plains near the seacoast. These are crops that don't just rot in standing water. When you're dealing with puddles of standing water due to substantial rain, they thrive. In fact, rice is often grown in paddies, meaning that they bank up the sides of the field and then they flood it. And then the rice grows well that way. Also, the South, particularly in the low, flat areas, were one of the early utilizers of river transportation. Here, unless you have a small canoe or kayak, you're not going to be transporting goods along the French Broad River because your boat is going to be stopped by the rapids that go through Madison County. You can't navigate a river barge down the French Broad River. Not at least until you get to Knoxville, and then it connects to the Holston, and then the Tennessee, and then eventually the Mississippi. By that point, then yes, you could load up a barge with freight, and you could transport it up or down river. But not around here. No, we're in the mountains. But if you go further east, then yeah, you have these giant rivers that are flat and deep and safe for freight transport. A little more about the Southern colonies. Obviously, this is where the story of slavery comes in. Slavery died out in the northern colonies, and in many cases by 1800. Not because those people were particularly more ethical. It's mainly just because it wasn't practical in the northern colonies. But in the southern colonies, these large plantations required huge workforces, and the plantation owners found it most profitable to utilize slave labor. There were smaller farms. I can only imagine that Hezekiah Witt, yes, one of my ancestors was named Hezekiah Witt, would have been a small farmer somewhere in Rutherford County. He would have been a small farmer by virtue of living here, and he was poor enough that he lived here, but he must have had some land. I've got to find it somewhere, but he must have had some land enough to grow a farm, because that's what people did back here. And there's generally a lack of industry. Why? Because those with capital and the ability to invest that capital are going to get a greater return on agriculture. If you got a good business head and you have a chunk of money, the idea is to turn that chunk of money into a bigger chunk of money. That's how business works. Now, how do you do that most effectively? If you live in South Carolina or if you live in North Carolina, you invest in a plantation. That's how you grow your money most quickly. And so you don't have people investing. So farming was essential to the colonies. It just was. Because pre-industrial revolution, that's just how most people lived. But the key difference is that in the southern colonies, farming was not just a way of life. It was an extremely profitable enterprise. Okay, and so the second part is, how does this affect who we are? What does American culture mean? And that's just these colonists living 12,000 miles from Britain over time developed an individual identity. For example, the idea of religious freedom. So the Establishment Clause to the United States Constitution is embedded into the First Amendment. And it is that Congress shall make no ruling regarding the establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Ergo, it's why we talk about religion a lot in this class, but I don't teach you a particular faith. There's a key difference there. I talk about religion all the time. That's a huge aspect in social studies. But I'm not teaching you a particular way of thinking, because that would be a violation of the Constitution, that state funds being used to teach a particular faith. Because we, as Americans, value religious freedom. We do. But let's also be honest. Some, not all, of the founding fathers were deeply religious. Not all, many were deists, but also many were devoted members of their faith. But even they valued the ideal of religious tolerance. Once more, it's embedded into the First Amendment. The freedom of expression. Be who you want to be, as long as who you are does not hurt other people. If you want to wear an eye patch, fine. If your eye patch shoots lasers at people, not fine. Exercise your freedom. And the limit of your freedom is when it interacts and contradicts someone else's freedom. So the freedom to oppress is not a freedom that we recognize. But the freedom to express is one that we value. Key difference, right? And it has a lot to do with who we are as Americans. And once more, it has a lot to do with how we framed our Constitution. Okay. More on religion. We must also, again, if you're going to teach early American history, you have to include discussions of the Puritans. And you have to understand the importance of Protestant Christianity on American culture. And some of that dates back to Jonathan Edwards, if you're familiar with him. He was a famous preacher in colonial America. He also had a close friend, David something, it escapes my mind, who ministered to the Native Americans. But these gentlemen traveled all over the country preaching about their particular brand of faith. We'll call it fundamentalism. And the emphasis on a personal religious experience. If you were an Anglican in England, you were part of the English church, your religious experience might be defined by your participation in the ceremonies on the Sabbath. And that might be the limit of your religious experience. You might pray, but you're generally going to a priest to intercede on your behalf. Edwards and other Puritans taught that no, faith is a personal experience. It's something that defines your life. It defines your identity. And it's something that you have to interpret for yourself. That is tied up into the Great Awakening. America's first schools and colleges predate the Revolution. There was a Battle of Princeton during the Revolutionary War that actually occurred at Princeton University. And so many of these colleges, like Princeton, were founded to teach ministers. And so religious experience was once more closely tied in. While the Constitution contains the Establishment Clause, and it's the reason I don't get into my personal religious beliefs, it wasn't always interpreted that way. Because many schools and colleges in the United States were primarily religious. Now, granted, they didn't receive public funds, and that's where the real question came in. There was no such thing as a tax-supported public school until 1834. And there was no such thing as compulsory tax-supported education until well after the Civil War. There was no public high school until, even around World War II. These were still relatively new phenomena. And so, yes, all these schools like Princeton, Harvard, and so forth that were designed to train ministers were private universities. So, something else that we need to understand in regards to education. Slave codes actually prohibited the education of slaves. And so even in early American history, people understood the value of education because they didn't want slaves to have it. Because they knew that if individuals like Frederick Douglass became educated and were able to read, then they would start questioning things. If you're able to read and you're a slave, and you see the Declaration of Independence where it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all are created equal. Well, then that leads you to start questioning, right? So if it says all men are created equal, and then in the civil rights movement you have a man holding up a sign that says, I am a man, I think the interpretation's obvious, right? If it says all men are created equal, and by the way, I'm a man, okay? But also, like every other civilization prior, the family is the fundamental element of every society. Having a kid has really brought this home to me of just the importance of my family. And, of course, families in colonial America followed a kind of Protestant tradition, maybe even a patriarchal culture, where the man was the de facto head, even formally the head, where the white males were the only individuals in colonial society that could vote, and they were seen to be as representatives of their family. I think we went over this in American history, that the term husband is an agricultural term, like animal husbandry. The husband is expected to guide the family. And all that's, very much kind of traditional Protestant ethos. But even though you have this kind of patriarchal culture, there's also the spirit of egalitarianism. Egalitarianism, and the words almost in the term, is a philosophy of equality. One of the strengths of our school is a spirit of egalitarianism. Is that eye patch kid is just the same as face tattoo kid. Face tattoo kid, whatever. He wants a lightning strike across his face. I guess it's a Harry Potter reference. I don't know. Anyway, so that's fine. Eye patch kid, whatever. Is he a decent person? Is she going to be nice to me? Those are the things I'm concerned with, not do they have a weird tattoo on their face, whatever. Again, that's what egalitarianism means. And so there were many aspects of English culture that we did adopt and incorporate into our Constitution. Like traditional English rights, like the Magna Carta, the idea that we're all equal under the law. And this brings in John Locke, and I've got his book over there if you want to read it. John Locke coined the idea of the social contract. The government is accountable to the people they serve, and that the people of said government imbue that government with the powers to rule. And if they fail to represent the people's interest, if they infringe on the inherent rights of the people, that government has failed in its essential duty, and it has lost its right to govern. It's John Locke in a nutshell. So taxation without representation means that the government has failed in its essential duty. And if that's how you choose to interpret it, then they don't need to be your government anymore. And Locke argued that the people of said government have a duty to hold their government accountable. And if their government fails to be held accountable, those same people have a duty to overthrow it. It's hardcore, right? Yeah. Now, another fundamental aspect of our American identity is that we do believe that the people hold the government accountable, that the government exists by consent of the governed.